That was a good, actually. So the segue they can make that make sense is probably within 1 to 2 months after my diagnosis, I gave my first Toastmaster speech about it. It was an incredibly vulnerable feeling to say I am a diabetic, because whoa, was this like a term I didn't even like saying. It felt unhealthy. It felt strange. But owning that and being able to explain it in a very methodical way was kind of a healing process in a way. So if I back up to diagnosis, what is a type 1 diabetic? When probably it was around, I think it was Halloween. So Halloween's never quite been the same. But I remember it was about October 31st, 4 to 5 years ago at this point. I just felt incredibly stressed, lots of anxiety. I was drinking a ton of water. I could eat as much as I wanted, and I wasn't gaining any weight. So for most people, they would say, wow, Heather, like I kind of wish I had that problem. But with a type 1 diabetic, what makes it difficult and dangerous is that your pancreas, the insulin producing organ of your body, quits. So that means I have to begin to think like a pancreas, administer insulin manually like a pancreas. And it impacts every decision, from drinking alcohol to eating food to deciding whether or not you need to eat something before you go out for a walk, or, I mean, everything that you think about and do. So versus a type 2 diabetic who produces insulin, but often it is associated with being overweight or being unhealthy, because even though your pancreas is working really hard to produce that insulin, there's not enough of it to cover your large mass, right? Sometimes it's genetic, so that's not a fair assumption to say everyone is overweight. But it often trends that way for between type 1 and type 2. So that's the significant difference. Is type 1, you're incredibly reliant because you produce zero insulin. So this brain needs to start doing math every time you eat, every time you go out for a walk, every time you make a decision with what you're putting into your body. It's going to take a toll on or make an impact on how much insulin you give yourself.
Basically, everything that we take for granted, you have to do the math and figure out. Because I think, like you said last time, if you eat, you have to figure out how much. Does it depend on how much you eat or the type of foods you eat?
Absolutely. Yeah. Like I never have counted carbs in my life.
And now you
and
do.
Suddenly I do, right? And often it's associated with like, it's sugar, right? When you think about like, that a diabetic must have to like keep track of the sugar. Well, sugar does pretty much align well, I think, with carbohydrates when you kind of look at what is in food. But really, it's the carb counting. Like I never knew how many carbs were in corn or green beans or my cereal and milk and banana that I would eat every day. And I think, oh my gosh, if only I knew how incredibly amount of, carb heavy that was, maybe I would have switched. But as a healthy person who has a working pancreas, it's a very healthy, nutritious breakfast, as long as it's not like Cocoa Pebbles every day. Now I'm a much more protein and fat focused. So you'd almost call it kind of a ketogenic diet in that way. But believe me, I also love my carbs. So I can't ever say I'm going to throw carbs out the window. But protein and fat is a huge part of my diet.
And basically the insulin, I think you described last time, you eat carbs, it's broken down into glucose. Insulin is released, tells the cells to absorb the glucose.
Exactly.
And that's why you were so thirsty, because you just had glucose circulating with nowhere to go.
Yes, excellent description. So when you stop producing insulin, your cells cannot absorb that. So again, right, all of that glucose is circulating around in your blood system, has nowhere to go. So it's called polyuria, meaning you are drinking a lot of water and urinating all the time to try and pass that glucose out of your system. It's your body's way of coping. And bodies are incredibly resilient. Like they'll find a way. But I think the delay in the onset of me knowing or doing anything about it was I didn't know the symptoms. It was very gradual over time as my pancreas and if I'm going to get technical here, like the beta cells that actually produce insulin were being slowly kind of kicked out of my system over time. So it was a very gradual change, so that it didn't. I just kept feeling a little worse and a little worse until you finally got back to that really life-saving insulin regimen, and I didn't realize how much better I could feel by having it reintroduced to my system.
Yeah, once you get your body back in the homeostasis,
Yes.
was it like, oh,
It felt good. I felt my anxiety like go down that I didn't really know existed, and I think thankfully at the time I was training for a half marathon, so I was using a lot of the glucose I was eating by running, which was a huge help to kind of again stave off the symptoms I otherwise would have felt.
So if you couldn't, you said you were still using the glucose, but if you couldn't absorb it, like how were you utilizing? I guess I'm just trying to think. You said you were utilizing glucose because you're running a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So is there another secondary way your
so
body's able to absorb it?
Yeah, so it's your muscles will use glucose, or your general activity, right? Instead of, if you're very sedentary and take insulin, right? It's saying, well, you're not doing anything, so let's just absorb all that extra glucose into fat and store it. Otherwise, if I'm training, right, there's going to be other processes, motor functions, active things within your body that will use that glucose instead.
Okay, this is just extra glucose that if you aren't actively walking or running, it's just like, yeah. So okay, that
So
makes
sometimes
sense.
so it's a great point, because like if
Yeah.
I eat too much, it's better for, and I'm just like, whoa, Heather, you really overate today. It's better for me just to go for a walk and get my glucose to level out than just say, no, instead I'm gonna have eaten all that pie or all those cookies and then sit on the couch and just take the extra insulin. Because what I'm actively saying is, I'm going to store this. I'm choosing to
body
store this
fat.
as fat, and I'm not going to work it off, right? It's an ironic way, Eric, that's taught me, like, diabetics have to eat. If you do it well, and no one's perfect, but if you really do it well, you eat like every adult should. Everything in moderation, I say, including moderation itself, because you have to have your cheat days. But you have the sliver of pie, and that's it. Or you have what is kind of allowed to you, or you focus on your protein, you focus on the fats that don't really raise your glucose instead. So you can get into trouble that way. But what it does is makes you focus to lay off the carbs. Or I'll choose like the cornbread, or I'll choose the higher ranking carb in my mind and say, like, I don't need the roll. I'm going to choose to eat the dessert instead.
Okay.
So you make choices. You don't get it all the time.
It's kind of funny though. You can almost like, not that you would, but it's like, well, if I just go out and walk, I'll absorb and utilize the glucose rather than have to inject myself, and it'll just be stored as body fat. It's just kind of like sitting there waiting. Like, what is she gonna do? That's kind of
Because as humans, we are wired to go to the path of least resistance, and when you don't have to actively think about it, it's like if I have this beautiful piece of pie sitting here, I have to say I am going to eat this whole piece of pie, so I have to plan in order to eat this whole piece of pie. So you're actively thinking about preparing to overeat. And it's almost like, oh, is it worth it?
yeah.
Instead of just saying, nope, I'm going to eat the pie and whatever. So it is a good check for myself, right?
It's a complete lifestyle change.
It is, yes.
And it's unfortunate you have to do it, but in a way you'll probably be You're probably healthier than the average person, because you have to consciously, every time you eat, think about what you're eating, rather than you go to the dessert plate. Well, I'll take some of this, some of that, and you cram it all down, and oh, my stomach hurts, but you wait an hour and it go. It's you don't have to think about any of that.
And it's a benefit. I mean, as I can look at my watch here, and that's why I love Apple Watch, because they are a really integrated piece of technology. It tracks my glucose, so I wear a continuous glucose monitor attached to me that will give me a report of my blood sugar every 5 minutes, so I can see the trends, the roller coaster, if you will. Hopefully, not a steep roller coaster if I'm doing things right. That say, hey, you're getting low, you might need to eat something, or hey, whoa, you're in the 200s or something. So if I'm relative, a normal adult has a blood sugar between like 80 and 120.
Okay.
So that's the goal kind of you're shooting for. But like if you have to manually do it all the time, I can be up in the 200s. I've hit the 300s before, and it's like, whoa, like
what were you in the beginning, like before you
Eric,
even?
I can't even. I was off the charts. I remember. I know that I can know the number. It was 426. But people go into the ER in diabetic ketoacidosis, meaning they are spilling so much glucose that their body's literally like shutting down, and they're 800s. It's an incredibly unhealthy state, and they're wasting away because their body hasn't been able to store any of that glucose. Right, they're in an incredibly farther gone state than I was at the time.
So they're extremely malnourished, but they're eating like a. You can eat like a pig.
You can eat like absolute pig, and you can't absorb any of it. I know. It's a weird right? It's a weird thing to think about.
Fascinating.
It is. I know.
It really is. But like you said, if you manage it, you can live a really normal life. When you live a normal like.
Exactly. I would say of anything, I feel I would never go as far to say that it's a blessing in disguise, but it's made me reappreciate and recognize not to take the nourishment that we put into our bodies or the exercise we get to do every day for granted. And I'm selective, right, with what I choose to eat. So
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
Well, didn't you say milk is that dairy? It's high protein, low carb. It's actually a good
It is.
food to eat if you're a diabetic.
Yeah, so connecting all the dots, right? Talking about being a dairy advocate, right? Being in Toastmasters, YDLI, right? And then also connecting that to type 1. I mean, my brain has gone through, how do I make a platform to say, here I am, a unique condition of type 1, right? When you are first diagnosed, with many people, not only in my position, but a lot of other very hard diagnoses or life events they go through, it can feel very isolating to be rocked of the way things used to be. But when you are, there's these blips of community that come out of nowhere to say, hey, did you know I've gone through the same thing? Or don't worry, I know that you feel this way. I've been able to manage it. Or this is how we manage it, or whatever. So in not only my case, but there's a lot of other scenarios you apply that to, is it's not something people wear on their sleeve, but you can find a lot of those with shared experiences. Once you recognize and reach out for that community, there's so much support out there, which is wonderful.